morning, everybody. Welcome to Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, and as you can see, we have a very special program for you today. Don't worry, though, we will be covering live trials later on in the program. We will be live in the Armando Baptista case out of Florida. We're also going to give you the results in the Tennessee Tremaine Wilburn case, as well as the Iowa case of Zachary Keene. We have some verdicts in, and we will let you know. But as you saw from that opening graphic, we have a very special program, and this is the special election coverage program here on Law and Crime, because yesterday was the midterm elections, and we have some results. As you know, if you've been reading the news and been following it, the Democrats have taken control of the House. The Republicans have maintained control of the Senate and have actually increased their majority. There were some key governor races that were decided for both sides, as well as other high-profile elections as well. And you can see from this graphic, actually, the majority that was taken over by the Democrats. That becomes a huge, huge issue, because here on the program, we are going to discuss the aftermath and potential legal implications and outcomes from the election results, including what happened in the House. And right now, we want to get started, and I have two very special guests joining me on set. First up is our chief investigative correspondent, Brian Ross, and also joining us, what a treat we have, former representative here in New York, Elizabeth Holtzman. Great to have you both here on the program, and good morning.
Good morning to you.
Brian, I want to start with you. The Democrats have taken control of the House. This is a very big situation. I'm curious, what are you hearing about the implications? What are their plans now that they have control?
Well, this is, of course, the most significant outcome of yesterday's election. And this morning, President Trump is waking up to a much different Washington, no longer one-party rule. And we'll be hearing a lot now in the coming 2 years from four key Democrats who have become the chairman of very important committees. There's Congressman Jerry Nadler, who will now become the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. It could bring, if it wanted to, articles of impeachment. There is Richard Neal. He's chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. Under the law, that committee is allowed to obtain the tax returns of anybody under investigation, including Donald Trump. There's Elijah Cummings, a Democrat from Maryland, who becomes chairman of the Oversight Committee. He has a long list of issues he wants to pursue about the Trump administration. And finally, there's Adam Schiff, who will become the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. He has claimed again and again Republicans have done very little to actually investigate allegations of Russian collusion.
I'm glad you mentioned Adam Schiff, because that's what I want to talk about right now. As you know, this representative from California, Devin Nunes, is now out, and he's going to be taking over the Intelligence Committee, as Brian said. Here is a short statement from him about what this all means. Take a look.
You know what you're going to do as the chairman, and are you able to tell us who you want to bring back?
You know, I'm not able to tell you that tonight. We're certainly going to look at the work that we were able to do. We're going to look at the work that the GOP obstructed on our committee, and it was really worse than abdicating the responsibility of the committee. The majority went further to be complicit in the president's attacks on the independence of the Justice Department, on the men and women of the FBI, on our intelligence community. So we also need to restore the relationship between our committee and the intelligence community and law enforcement. But look, at the time when we formally take control of the House, that won't be until January. And we'll have to see what Bob Mueller has been able to do and what Bob Mueller has been able to say, either via indictment or via report. And that will also guide what we intend to do in our committee.
Okay, let's break this down a little bit. Ms. Holtzman, my question to you is, you served on the Judiciary Committee with Nixon, if I am correct.
During Watergate, the impeachment proceedings against him.
And that's what I want to talk about right now. Now that they're in control of the House, do you think it's wise for them to begin the impeachment process? And let's say they want to draft articles of impeachment, because we know it begins there. Is that a wise move to do, in your opinion?
I think people don't really understand impeachment. The proper process, the only time impeachment was properly conducted was with respect to Richard Nixon, when it was a fair process and a totally bipartisan process, and one that has withstood the test of history and the judgment of history. Nobody has said that that was a gotcha moment, that that was an unfair moment, that it was an unconstitutional moment. That's a moment that everybody still takes pride in, because it was done the right way. We didn't start off saying we're getting the president, even though the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate. It was the American people who said, Congress, you've got to do something about this, after the President of the United States fired the special prosecutor. He said, special prosecutor, you can't go and get tapes that are going to show whether I'm guilty or not. And the American people said, Mr. President, you can't decide on who's going to investigate you. And they demanded that Congress acted. When we started, there was no vote, no count of the of the Judiciary Committee, the House of Representatives, or the Senate. We didn't even know what a high crime and misdemeanor was. We didn't know what the grounds were for impeachment. When we started the inquiry, we started saying, what is the law? What are the facts? Do the facts justify impeachment? That's how it worked. And a bipartisan group, Republicans and Democrats, drafted the articles of impeachment. So it's not going to work if the Democrats say, you know, we took power, we're going to get the president. The American people won't stand for it, and they shouldn't. But if they conduct proper inquiries, and if the facts are there to justify impeachment, then they should go ahead, because that's their constitutional responsibility. But until they conduct proper and full investigations, they should never go for impeachment.
I'm glad you said that, because this is always a word that people throw out, and we know that is a, you know, you have the House where it begins, and then the Senate is where the trial would ultimately happen. But obviously, we can't talk about what's the results of this without getting the response from the White House administration. So we actually have a tweet from President Trump I want to throw up here if we can, because he had some words about what the latest is. So he said, if the Democrats think they're going to waste taxpayer money investigating us at the House level, then we will likewise be forced to consider investigating them for all the leaks of classified information and much else at the Senate level. Two can play that game. And then I want us to show something from Kellyanne Conway yesterday in response to this. You might have missed it. She had a statement last night as the results were coming in. Let's play that for you right now.
Tonight.
Is he concerned about this impeachment threat?
We're not really talking about it. He said yesterday they'll do what they want to do, and he'll do what he needs to do. I don't know that there will be much of an appetite, Kristen, all across this country in some of these Democratic districts among the constituents for their members to be spending all of their time, or even most of their time, or a fraction of their time, investigating, instigating, trying to impeach and subpoena people. That's a decision they'll need to make, but you have to really give the voters what they want. And as far as I can tell, there aren't many voters out there who say, you know, I'm going to give you an affirmative vote today because you've promised to investigate everybody or impeach the president. There seems to be no little appetite for that. In fact, I've hardly heard the words Russian collusion all night, and I think there's something to that.
Okay, so I have to get the reaction from you, Ms. Holtzman, first, as you were watching it. What did you think?
She doesn't know what she's talking about. I was on the House Judiciary Committee. We had to work 24/7 to understand what a high crime and misdemeanor was, to absorb all the facts. We worked day and night like dogs, dealing with the investigation, impeachment inquiry, and then the vote. But guess what? We had all the rest of our congressional work to do, and we were just one committee. We did the impeachment work, we did our own work, our constituent work, and the rest of the House of Representatives did its business. The idea that impeachment interferes with the work of the House of Representatives is just nonsense. The members of the House Judiciary Committee can do both their jobs on impeachment and with regard to constituent services and with regard to the work of the House, and the House of Representatives can continue its work. So the idea that this interferes is nonsense. And we want to talk about waste of money. The President sending down troops to the border for a backdrop for the election. What is that? That's not only a waste of money, that might have been tens of millions of dollars, but an abuse of power.
Brian, what do you think about that?
You know, I think aside from impeachment, there are so many other issues where the leaders of these committees will be able to hire staff to investigate, to issue subpoenas that will make life miserable for people in the White House if they have anything to hide. And the Democrats are convinced that the White House has been hiding the ball, has been essentially in collusion with Republican leaders of the House, not asking the right questions, instead of focusing on Russia, focusing on the FBI and the Justice Department. This is going to change a lot, even if impeachment is off the table.
Right, right, because there's so many issues. When the Senate and the House conducted inquiries into obstruction of justice, into the Russian collusion, first of all, They didn't call certain witnesses. They didn't ask witnesses all the questions. So there are investigations that need to be completed. But nobody's really looked in Congress at the whole question of the president's emoluments, the monies that he's taking.
I want to talk about that right now.
That?
Brian, what are you hearing about the idea that he has to turn over his taxes and that he's going to have to be forthcoming now with information that maybe he didn't have to be so forthcoming when the Republicans were in control of the entire Congress? So what have you been hearing?
Under the law, the House Ways and Means Committee can obtain the tax returns of any individual if it's part of a legitimate investigation, which means that the Democratic chairman of the Ways and Means, Richard Neal of Massachusetts, could make that request. And Secretary of Treasury Stephen Mnuchin, who oversees the IRS, says he would abide by that request if it came from Congress, which means it's likely, it seems to me, that Trump's tax returns, which he has kept secret throughout the campaign, even after promising to turn them over, may finally be known to investigators.
Okay, well, joining us right now, we have a very special guest joining us only through audio. Wish we had him here on the set, but we have with us election law professor from Ohio State University, Professor Ned Foley. Professor, great to have you here on Law and Crime. I know you've been hearing this discussion, this back and forth. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what are the best legal avenues for the Trump administration moving forward in terms of, you know, maybe there's subpoenas coming forward against different members of his administration? Does he have to, can he withhold his tax returns? And what about the impeachment issue that we've been talking about at the beginning? What are the legal avenues for the administration and for President Trump moving forward?
Sure. Well, good morning. I'm delighted to be with you. I think it's important to break some of this down into subparts. If you want to take impeachment first, that's fine, or the subpoena issues separately. Both of them have both a legal component to it and a political component. I would say, you know, the impeachment part has a greater share of the politics compared to law, whereas the subpoena issue, the ratio goes in the other direction, more law. Politics is obviously relevant, but you know, you could easily see a subpoena issue going to the U.S. Supreme Court. There's obviously the precedent from the Nixon Watergate tapes case, which you know, sustained the power of the judiciary to, and the presidency complied. The facts here would be a little bit different, again, depending upon exactly what was subpoenaed. But there are some open questions, and it really ultimately depends on what the U.S. Supreme Court does and how the Trump presidency responds to any judicial decree that comes from the court.
Yeah, there's a lot at stake here, and we have a lot to talk about. This is just the beginning part of our coverage. I do want to note one thing, two things actually. First of all, Ms. Holtzman, you have a great book, and I want to talk about it, The Case for Impeaching Trump. We're going to talk a little bit more about that on our next block, but I do want to let our viewers know one important thing before we go to our next break, is that in Wisconsin, Democrat Tony Evers just beat out Republican Scott Walker to take over the governorship, and this creates very interesting implications for the Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey case, you know, the Making the Murderer show. This is really what we want to talk about. Will Mr. Evers investigate alleged corruption in the police department? Will he open files into the investigation of Teresa Halbach? Will he reverse the Dassey and Avery convictions? And we know at the very least that he's required to create a pardon board. So this is very interesting to see what will happen. We'll take a quick break on our end, but when we come back, we have a lot more special coverage from the election. Stay tuned. Welcome back to our special election coverage here on Law and Crime, and we're talking about all of the legal implications from the results from last night and going into this morning. So let's talk a little bit now about Georgia. As you know, there is a hotly contested governorship race right now between Republican Brian Kemp and Democrat Stacey Abrams. I want to show the latest right now with Kemp leading at a 50.55% margin against Abrams at 48.6%. It should be noted that while Kemp is the projected winner, Abrams hasn't conceded. And I want to talk about what this means. And back here joining us, I have two special guests with me on set, as well as another one via Skype. But first, I want to bring in Chief Investigative Correspondent Brian Ross. Brian, what's the latest that you're hearing about Abrams not conceding? What is going on there?
Well, the difference is about 75,000 votes, and there are lots of questions about voter suppression and irregularities at the polls. Also, the law in Georgia is if neither candidate gets 50%, there would be a runoff election in December. And Abrams has been saying to people, we're going to get a do-over. It's not quite clear, but she's not prepared to concede because the lead is so small.
Yeah, and this was a very ugly race. We're going to talk about what this means in a second, but I just want to get the reaction right now from my other very special guest, former representative here in New York, Elizabeth Holtzman. Are you surprised by the results of this?
Well, I think it's amazing and astonishing and wonderful that an African-American woman in a state that was part of the Confederacy can at least get, if not win, at least come so close to winning. That's a great statement about how much progress has been made. On the other hand, Georgia has been a very ugly place for voter repression, and reports have come out, not just on Election Day, but before that, about Brian Kemp's handling of this, closing down of polling places, trying to close down lots of polling places, and what happened on Election Day. All of a sudden, wires are missing. Why is that happening in a county that could have been very important for Stacey Abrams? And the other problem is that her opponent in this race, Brian Kemp, is the Secretary of State. He's running for office, and he's the one who oversees the election process. There's a huge conflict of interest that never should have happened. I mean, if we're a country where we based on the rule of law, then we ought to have fair and free and open and transparent elections which aren't tampered with. Whoever wins, wins, but it should be the voice of the people and not the voice of the candidates putting their finger on the thumb here. That's not what a free election is about.
Joining us also via phone is election law professor from Ohio State University, Professor Ned Foley. Professor Foley, listening to this, do you think that there are grounds against Mr. Kemp that he acted improperly leading up to this election?
Oh, definitely. What happened in Georgia running up to yesterday's election day was, I think, the worst exhibit of the kind of partisan interference with the electoral process that we've seen in recent memory. I mean, our system has been deteriorating in this respect since 2000, Bush versus Gore, and things have gotten, unfortunately, uglier and uglier. But this entered new territory of a real danger zone. I mean, I don't want to be overly alarmist because I don't want a self-fulfilling prophecy of losing our democracy. So I think it's very important to be measured and in terms of what's going on. But anybody who cares about democracy and the process of running elections has to be concerned about what happened in Georgia this year, and significantly more concerned than other things that we've seen in decades.
Well, Professor, this is the Law and Crime Network. So the lawsuit that was filed by voters represented by the nonpartisan nonprofit Protect Democracy, they're seeking to bar Kemp from presiding over his own election. They've accused him of violating the constitutional right to due process. I'm curious if you had an opportunity to see the merits of their lawsuit and whether or not this holds water.
I've looked at it a little bit. I will say one thing that's important is that Georgia, I'm pretty confident, is in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, and that has a very strong record of due process protections for the voting process, a case called Roe versus Alabama, which is of nationwide note, but it's directly authoritative here. That's from the 1990s. And so there's a basis for claiming that any improper changing of the rules or manipulation or distortion of the voting process raises federal constitutional issues under this Roe versus Alabama precedent from the 1990s. So that's something to keep an eye on. I think the first issue that arose with the new lawsuit was a question of timing. There were some questions about whether it was filed too late. That's not my initial judgment, insofar as it concerns Secretary of State Kemp's supervision of any recount or any canvassing of the returns. I think the judiciary is going to look at that differently from lawsuits that are filed right before Election Day to affect the casting of ballots. So there's a lot of legal issues to sort out, but I think it's a very live event, live litigation, and to be watched closely.
Well, this is an interesting election to follow, and if anybody hasn't seen it, here's an election ad, a campaign ad from Brian Kemp, and it's something to watch. Take a look.
Yeah, I'm so conservative. I blow up government spending. I own guns that no one's taking away. My chainsaw's ready to rip up some regulations. I got a big truck, just in case I need to round up criminal illegals and take them home myself. Yep, I just said that. I'm Brian Kemp. If you want a politically incorrect conservative, that's me. I'm Brian Kemp. I'm so conservative.
I'm curious from your perspective, Ms. Holtzman, about seeing that ad and this election here down in Georgia, what it was like.
Well, to me, it's a horrific ad. He's got no business doing personal law enforcement. He can't even actually enforce the law with regard to fair elections in Georgia. I mean, to pick up illegal aliens? I mean, what's he talking about? Chainsaws and guns and blowing up government? Well, I mean, we're a peaceful country. We have a rule of law here. We don't shoot each other up in order to govern. That's what he's saying. It's horrific.
And Brian, he's tapped into a very ugly aspect that we saw across the country in this election, often led by the President of the United States, who ran ads that were really racist, many said, and just flat out wrong. And this is old-style Southern politics, not the new sort of South that we thought maybe had taken hold in Georgia.
And Brian, he accused the Democrats and Abrams of hacking. I mean, that's a serious accusation right there. With
no evidence whatsoever. He just announced an investigation. He authorized the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to initiate an inquiry with no evidence. And it played very well, I guess, because he seems to have a lead that of 75, 80,000 votes right now.
Yeah, and it looks like he might win it. Now, I know we have to sign off our great guest over here, but I just want you to take a minute to talk about your book and what you hope readers would get from this.
Well, I hope people buy the book and read the book.
Well, they will after watching us here on Law and Crime.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think the important thing is for people to understand that there was a process that worked when it came to impeachment. And there was a process where we held a president accountable. That was the important thing. The framers of the Constitution created the impeachment power to rein in a president who put himself above the law, who abused the power of his office. And the Congress is given the responsibility to deal with that, to protect our democracy. And it was done in a proper way. This actually gives a short but very concise view of what happened during the Nixon impeachment, which is the model, the gold standard, and how it applies to Donald Trump. Not saying that Trump should be impeached, but there certainly is enough evidence now to warrant the start of investigations into a variety of issues. Don't have to be conducted by the Judiciary Committee, and they don't have to be part of an impeachment inquiry, but to find out the facts of the abuses of power that took place under President Trump. And then we see where it goes.
Elizabeth Holtzman, thank you so much for coming on and
Thank
giving
you.
your perspective. Brian, stick around. We got a lot more to talk about. We'll be right back right after this. Welcome back to our special election coverage here on the Law and Crime Network. And we can't talk about the election without talking about voting problems, voting issues, and we're going to spend some time talking about that. Now, we can't talk about that without focusing on a special group called ProPublica, which is a nonprofit news organization that created a special coalition covering election-related issues. And our very own Brian Ross has a report on that. Brian.
Well, Jesse, about 100 million people in this country voted yesterday, and amid allegations and concerns about voter fraud, voter suppression, ProPublica set up a coalition of about 140 news organizations around the country with some 250 reporters to get real-time reporting on issues that were perhaps taking place around the country. Using Google and connections with other news organizations, this is the first time anybody's really put together this kind of operation. And I talked about it with the editor-in-chief of ProPublica, Stephen Engelberg. We're seeing here. What do you have?
Well, the idea here is that once upon a time, you covered Election Day, to see who won, and then problems on Election Day were covered like 2 weeks later. Somebody would say they were lines or something. And we asked the question, what would happen if you tried to cover the events of Election Day in real time using the 21st century tools that we now have available, which would be social media, call-in lines, tweets, you name it. And so we have created this newsroom which gathers all that information and then sends it out to local newsrooms across the country where they can investigate in real time and maybe even fix some of the things before the day is over. So that's the general idea.
And what are we seeing, for instance, here on the...
Well, we have a number of different ways of tracking this. Here what we're looking at is Google has provided us with certain kinds of searches. So if somebody wants to know about long wait times, it comes up in a yellow light. Provisional ballots, it comes up in a blue light. These are signs that things are going wrong. It helps us sort of think about where we should be focusing our resources. But this is only one piece of how you know what's happening. You have all these different things. We're also hooked up with the Lawyers Committee, who's getting phone-in stuff, and so there's a whole sort of blizzard of information that sort of comes to here. And we also have reporters here who are then going out and doing stories of their own right from here. And so it's a kind of mix of both what we're doing in this newsroom, but what we're also doing out in the country to sort of, light some fires.
So as of right now, 6 o'clock on election night, what trends are you seeing?
Well, what we see so far, and it's really hard to know, are you seeing more things because you're looking, or are you seeing more things because things are a mess? I mean, my general impression is that the voting system in the midterms was not prepared for the volume of people who showed up. So we seem to be seeing a lot of reports of long lines, a lot of frustration.
Do you see this as deliberate or just a bureaucracy unprepared for what happened?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. I think, studies have shown that if you look at Republican states with heavy minority populations, there tend to be fewer polling places. Is that a coincidence? Those places are also underserved in a lot of ways. It does happen to help the people in power make sure that they're in power and get fewer votes for their opponents. But I think it's one of the things that you have to look at in a kind of granular way, and it's something that I, in our coverage going forward from today, want to know more about.
So, Jessica, what have you seen so far on this election day?
So the main thing that we're seeing is very long lines across the country. I think that a lot of election administrators were not prepared for the type of turnout that we're seeing in states like Atlanta and states like Georgia and North Carolina. Atlanta is a particular hotspot in terms of very long lines with not enough poll worker resources. There's a real energy in Georgia that I don't think poll workers really anticipating either, which is driving along lines and are also keeping people in those lines.
Now, the Secretary of State will oversee his own election for governor, I take it, at this point.
Oh, yes. He's already overseeing his own election, which has presented really interesting problems for us.
How so?
So, we reported yesterday, for example, that the governor's office, with almost no evidence whatsoever, accused the Georgia Democratic Party of hacking the voter registration website. And what we found was that they actually had identified a vulnerability that existed in their system that they spent the entire day denying to us. So that was interesting for us to learn, and they continue to deny that there was a vulnerability despite our proof of it. And it's interesting that a person running for governor could, with so little evidence, accuse his opponent and their party of hacking the voter registration website in such a politicized environment. It's a very unique situation there. And I do want to make clear that secretaries of state manage their own elections all the time. Of course, they are elected officials. This is just a particularly partisan and rancorous environment in Georgia, and he's declined to recuse himself from integral steps in the process.
At this point, have you seen any evidence of what is often called voter fraud? People voting twice, people who aren't registered to vote?
No, much like 2016, we have seen no evidence of that whatsoever. I am confident that there are very isolated cases of that across the country. We are certainly not seeing it en masse.
And there's such attention to that from the Justice Department, from the President of the United States. Is that misplaced?
I think it is misplaced. I think that there are much more common issues that voters are going to face. Misinformation from poll workers who may be poorly trained or misunderstand the laws. That disenfranchises much more people than voter fraud happens. You'll also see people confused by recently changed voting laws or changing polling places. We're seeing that across the country. You know, I think if more attention and focus and funding was directed at election administration, we would see many fewer problems. But right now, the attention is sort of being pulled away by things that aren't truly a problem.
Great report, Brian, and really interesting stuff. That's why we brought in our own special guest right now, a journalist here at Quartz, John Keefe. John, great to have you here on Law and Crime.
Thank you.
So can you tell us a little bit more about this? I mean, we get a really great understanding from Brian's report, but I'm curious, you've been following this as well, and it seems like an amazing organization, especially during this time.
Yeah, well, if you're a local reporter, it used to be that you would find out about problems at the polls late in the day. You know, right around 5 or 6 o'clock, you'd hear, wow, there was a problem at this particular polling spot, long lines, maybe you'd been driving around. What we were trying to do is move that timeline up, and so that we could be reporting on problems at the polls in time to bring them to the attention of the officials and say, hey, what's going on? That actually happened yesterday in New York City, where early in the morning we had very credible and solid reports about problems with scanners, paper ballot scanners jamming all over the city. And we were able to have on the local radio station in New York City a report at noon, at lunchtime, about what was going on and how things were going poorly in some of these polling locations. And then we actually were able to get comments from the Board of Elections and see what's going on. And there was even calls for the head of the Board of Elections to resign by the City Council Speaker. So that kind of thing happened before midday. And that is new. That is not something that we were able to do before. And we were doing this for news organizations all over the country. As you all were mentioning, about 140 news organizations were participating. So when we were getting tips into the election line newsroom, we were feeding them out to these local reporters.
Do you see the prevalence of issues like this happening more in certain parts of the country, less in other parts of the country? Brian, I know you've been following this as well, so I'd like a perspective from both of you. I'll start with you, Brian.
Well, John, my questions last night to Steve and to Jessica Osman, there, who was the lead reporter there, was, you know, do you see actual voter fraud, voter suppression, other than just, you know, bureaucracies that are inept,
right,
which Steve Engelbert suggested was really the case in New York. But did you see what could be considered criminal wrongdoing?
Right. So it is. We are very confident that if that were happening, we would see it. And we were not seeing it. We are not seeing it en masse at all. In fact, we weren't even seeing it very much in pockets. Now, there certainly may be particular incidences that happen around, and we wouldn't be able to detect that. But the notion that you heard in the last election cycle about busloads of people being bussed in to vote and stuff, we would absolutely have seen that, and we did not.
So you think this was a clean election?
As clean as elections can be in that way, yeah, I think we saw very big problems with long lines and confusion around anywhere and anything from a broken machine or many broken machines to poll sites that have been merged into one, creating huge lines without additional resources. That's some of what was happening in Georgia.
Deliberate?
So, well, you know, as I think Steve was saying, it is hard to believe that the fact that many of these poll site consolidation since they happen in areas that tend to be democratic and things like that, that the people in power, we know that the people in power don't want to be voted out of power, so making voting more difficult can actually be advantageous to somebody in power. So I think to that degree, could it be deliberate? You know, I think policies have effects.
So that's worthy of a further investigation, I take it.
For sure, and the folks at ProPublica and Quartz and elsewhere have been covering these changes, these voting law changes, and how big an effect, how many poll sites are disappearing and what that means for people trying to vote. We had 5-hour lines in Georgia last night, and it's hard for somebody to stand in line for 5 hours to cast a ballot.
It's hard enough for everybody to go to actually make a vote and have to deal with those issues. But you know, that is not the only strange incidents we saw during election night. In fact, if you missed this, we're going to play it for you right now. We saw an election judge and supervisor in Texas who had to resign after getting a little testy with a voter. Take a look at this exchange.
Get out! Get out! Get out! You are rude. You are not following the law.
Ma'am.
Go.
Just calm down.
Get out! Get out! Get out!
Okay, so that was Lila Guzman. I got to ask you, John, in your analysis, to seeing a lot of this across the country, have you ever seen anything quite like this happen?
What I will say is that across the country, poll workers are sometimes trained just hours or days before they are in their position. So I think the notion of the boundary between an official, election official and a poll worker is something that we should talk about. Even in Georgia, it was pretty clear that people didn't have enough training to handle what was going on, Missouri too, in a lot of cases. So I think that people are people and these things happen. Personally, I haven't seen this kind of thing before, but I have no doubt that these kinds of interpersonal conflicts and other things will happen, especially when you have people, and I don't know about this particular case, but especially when you have people who are either very low paid or not paid, and joining as almost volunteers to help run an election, sometimes just days before the event.
John, I think we have only about 20 seconds off, so I'm just curious, changes that you would like to see as we move on to new elections moving forward, and you see all different kinds of issues.
Well, I think the biggest issue that I would see is that this move to early voting, it really takes a pressure off of a lot of these vote systems, although that wasn't necessarily the case in Georgia, so it remains to be seen there. But I think that the move to early voting, mail-in voting, these kinds of things is going to mean that this day of pressure where we have to stand in lines and we have to take care of machines and things like that will slowly fade away. And so I guess I'd like to see that.
Yeah, and Stacey Abrams out in Georgia again she's waiting. She hasn't conceded because she's waiting for those outstanding ballots from absentee and mail-in ballots. John Keefe, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right, everybody, stick around. We are still talking here on our special election coverage from Law and Crime, and there's a lot more issues to discuss. We'll be right back. Welcome back to our special election coverage here on Law and Crime. And we can't talk about special election without talking about what happened in Texas. Now, everybody across the country was following the race between Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz. And it appears that Ted Cruz has beat out Beto O'Rourke, but by a very slim margin, it looks like. And I want to show that right there, 50.9% against 48.3%. This is a race that everybody was watching. And I want to get the perspective right now, first from Brian Ross. Brian, as you were following this, I'm curious, were you surprised at the results? And also, we saw that there was an issue with the ballot shortage. So I'm curious how that might have affected, from what you've seen, the actual outcome in this race.
Well, that's hard to know. Certainly, this was one of the most closely watched Senate races in the country. President Trump overlooked his past disagreements with Senator Cruz and came to campaign for him. They became best of friends suddenly. So it was very tight. O'Rourke actually raised more money than Cruz. Democrats for a while were hoping this could be the first statewide Democrat elected in Texas since the 1990s. Not to be the case, of course. But inexplicably, with this huge expected turnout in Tarrant County, which is in the Fort Worth area, they ran out of paper ballots. And on top of running out of paper ballots, the electronic voting machines seem to be not working. And that is, we don't know the results of that or what the impact of that is, but it certainly was considered troubling, very troubling, by the Texas Civil Rights Project. I
want to talk about what you just said, because this is a really disturbing and problematic issue. And joining me right now here is Law and Crime from a Law and Crime Network is Ron Blitzer. Ron, great to have you here. You've been studying a little bit about the glitchy machines and issues that we've seen with, it's not even voter suppression. It's not even an issue of someone acting in a wrongdoing capacity. This is an actual issue with the technology. What have you learned about this?
Yeah, we've seen in a number of states, in Texas in particular, also in Georgia, that there were a lot of problems with the voting machines themselves. People say that it's been because of outdated technology, but some of the reports about this may have been a little bit overstated. Before Election Day, there were a lot of issues even with early voting. People in certain states are able to go into the polls in the days prior to Election Day. And there were complaints claiming that votes for O'Rourke were changed to Cruz in the system or deleted altogether. But I was in touch with the Secretary of State's office in Texas, and they said that across the state, they had less than 20 complaints about this, and it affected people of both parties. So as you were saying, it may not be a case of any kind of intentional foul play or something from one party or the other, but it is a sign that they do need to get their act together in terms of updating this technology.
So it might have been small, but I don't like to hear that. Do you? I mean, to hear that there's an issue, it doesn't make sense that this is happening.
Well, one, we know that the election commissions around the country are very local. They're not really up to date. And ironically, the FBI and investigators concluded that because of that, it makes it much harder for Russians or anybody else to hack in and to actually affect the outcome of any national voting, because it's so cumbersome and it's a patchwork quilt of operations. Nevertheless, it's not efficient for sure, and it does raise the question of, is it bureaucratic ineptitude, or is there some deliberate notion going on where we'll make sure in this county it's harder to vote, where people will get tired of standing in line 5 or 6 hours? And that's the question, I think, that really has not been answered.
And that's the question that I have to ask here, because we can debate back and forth about how it had an effect on the outcome. But hearing about this, I'm joined right now by election law professor from Ohio State University, Professor Ned Foley. Professor Foley, great to have you back. We're listening to this, and I wonder, in the lawyers in all of us, do you get the sense that there is a cause of action that could be brought by either a campaign or the voters, that really there was something going on that shouldn't have happened and they need some legal redress?
Depends on a comparison of two numbers. What we like to do is talk about the margin of victory, that's one number, versus the margin of litigation, the other number. So, you mentioned—
Spoken like a true lawyer, by the way.
I'm sorry?
Spoken like a true lawyer.
Exactly right. So you mentioned the problem of ballot shortages. I need to know how many, and I need to compare how many in relationship to the lead that Cruz would have over O'Rourke, for example. Because if it turns out, just hypothetically, there's 10,000 ballots short because of a real problem. This shouldn't have happened. Of course, it shouldn't have happened. But if the lead is 100,000 and the problem is only 10,000, then you can't sue. You can't litigate over that. The reason why I think the Georgia race is so important to focus on is there we still don't know whether or not that race is within the margin of litigation, because there are absentee ballots that haven't been counted and processed, and provisional ballots. Now, again, it's complicated in Georgia because it would go to a runoff. It wouldn't answer the race completely. But Georgia requires a close look to make sure that they count the votes properly there.
And speaking about legal action, I don't know if you had an opportunity to see this, but down in Missouri, there's an issue with the voter ID laws. The lawyers from the Advancement Project have asked the state judge in Missouri to direct county election officials to comply with an earlier court order saying that voters don't need to present a photo ID. I'm curious about your thoughts as we all try to wonder if there should be a change or if there are too many changes in voter ID laws.
So I think we have to separate the goal of good rules ahead of time. You know, there's fighting over voter ID and over gerrymandering, all sorts of things, and we should always improve our process. But then when elections come, we actually have to vote and conduct the elections with the rules, whatever they are, even if they're not perfect. And when we have an election, we then have to ask the key question, can we trust the results? Do we have a valid outcome that counts as democratic and small d democratic? The process worked. We have a legitimate victor. You know, that's ultimately the goal of elections, is to put people into office that are popular sovereignty, the people rule. And so the way to tell that is to see whether or not votes are, after they've been cast, were there any problems of such magnitude that you can't trust the outcome? So now that we've got the ballots, let's count them properly and let's look at and see whether there were voter ID issues that might affect that. Now, one of the things that concerned us ahead of time was all of this attempt to confuse people to stay home, right? And if you talk voter ID and you talk issues, you can cause people to suppress their own votes. The whole purpose of provisional ballots is to be a safety net in case there's a voter registration glitch or problem, this exact match thing that Georgia had that improperly took people off the rolls. All those things could be voter suppression, but the best way to avoid voter suppression is to go to the polls, even if you have to stand in line, even after you have to cast a provisional ballot, because you can't count a ballot that was never cast. But if the provisional ballot exists and the race is close enough, it could make a difference. And that's what we're seeing in Georgia.
Yeah, and we all want fair and free elections. So as you said, that the rule of the sovereign is able to come, we want the popular vote. We want everybody to make their stance. And we saw that actually happen with Kim Davis, who was a Rowan County clerk in Kentucky. And she captured national attention because she basically stirred the base for social conservatives, saying that she refused to provide marriage licenses to same-sex couples following the Supreme Court's legalization of gay marriage during 2015, and she lost her re-election. I want to ask Ron, again, when you saw that, were you surprised by that?
I was not. This was an incident that drew national attention, a lot of controversy. This was a government employee who was refusing to do her job because she was against gay marriage. And, you know, it's a tricky situation because she claims it has to do with her religion, which is a very personal thing.
I know. But
bottom line, I'd say democracy works.
Democracy works, but we're all divided. Brian Ross, Ron Blitzer, Professor Foley, thank you so much for joining us. We will be right back. Stay tuned.
Crime.